Corsair Clockworks, Chapter 7, in which Andrea has a harrowing court date. Monty Ronan sat on the rooftop, his back against a chimney. The rooftops of St. Emile were dark, their shapes vaguely standing out in the starlight. In the distance, the industrial district was the only bright speck on the horizon, along with its trails of steam rising into the night. Sleep was sparse at night, if he had any at all. Night was when the Nurgovod roamed, the uniforms of their assassin squads fading into the slightest shadows, and their forms slinking between them effortlessly. It was only imagined where the message actually was. Sounds murmured in the distance, echoing across the silent roofscapes. It was a far-reaching drumming, faint and indistinct. Trying to ignore the sound, Monty refocused his eyes on the Corsair shop. It was silent and dark, still in the night hours. The sound was coming closer, a repeated, banging noise. His familiar Pascal soared overhead and then circled to reach him. Monty held out a thickly gloved hand for him, yet Pascal remained airborne. His head darted back and forth, and his slender, curved beak hung open as he chirped out cries of warning. Monty was immediately on his feet, and with wand in hand commanded the air around him to allow him flight. Pascal led him to the grassy courtyard behind the building. Monty landed on the soft grass and ran toward a figure splayed on the ground. That noise was nearly on top of him, pelting her neck, her hair fanned in all directions and her golden eyes empty. No, it wasn't. The body was a man, a middle-aged man with black hair streaked with gray. A heavy cloak fanned out beneath him, the same wound beneath his bearded chin and reaching to his collarbone. Face trapped in terror, facing his own death, his brown eyes empty. Monty looked to his own hand, where a slender, metal messenger tube weighed heavily in his fingers. Knives struck the ground at his feet, and dark shapes approached at high speed. Master Ferris had been used like a slab of meat to attract prey. That sound was banging through his head on top of him. It was gunfire. Monty started awake from the tug at his glove. His hand clenched on his wand even while asleep, and instinctively he thrust it ahead of him, his chest heaving from rapid breaths. Pascal's high-pitched, light cries brought the world into focus finally, and Monty blinked down at where Pascal had been gently nipping at his left hand. He was sitting on the roof across from Corsair Clockworks, and the barest light showed through the chokingly overcast sky. It must have been just around dawn. His heartbeat finally settling, he wiped away his soppy bangs from his forehead. The sound had been rain. It was pouring. He had forgotten to cast any shields against it before accidentally nodding off, and now he was soaked and shivering. He let out a heaving groan and placed his head in his hands. He was in the middle of a fever, although he knew he couldn't blame his nightmare on that alone. Dreams about Master Ferris's death and the war front were happening more and more since his arrival in St. Emile. Pascal chirped and nudged his head against Monty's arm. He petted him gently, and then was racked by violent coughs. "All right," he sighed to Pascal. "You win. I'm going to the guild house. I'm going. Andrea will be fine for a few hours. Better than himself, anyway." Odd dreams had filled Andrea's nights consistently since reading the message. She supposed that had something to do with it. They weren't unpleasant, just odd. This night she had found herself surrounded by her schoolmates and Mrs. Castleberry, and she was barking at all of them to hand her various tools while she serviced a massive airship engine. They scrambled around her, although most of them dropped their tools and flinched every time Andrea blasted a new command. She had no patience for her assistants. Her work was too vital. Andrea woke with an unfamiliar swell of excitement in her chest, and it took her several minutes to compose herself enough to rise. She simply couldn't stay in bed. She had plans for that day, ones that didn't involve her running downstairs to her father's workshop to tinker, although after such a dream it was all she could think about. Today was a day for loftier dreams, she reminded herself. She had the whole plan perfectly thought out. In her finest, but not too showy, she would go to the courthouse where Sir Ventaris would be presiding over civil cases. She would then demand to see him and explain her entire, dire situation to him. Like the chivalrous man he was, he would agree to watch over her instantly. It was surely his duty as a knight, after all. Perhaps he would require her to live briefly in the baronial manor, and then when he would fall madly in love with her, she would stay for good. Thankfully, Julia was already having breakfast while Andrea got ready. Her little sister would have demanded to know why Andrea was taking such care in choosing her dress and precisely styling her hair. And in Andrea's giddiness, she would have had to tell her. Then Julia would have insisted on helping, and the two would have been giggling idiots well into the afternoon. Andrea was able to get herself ready without interruption, and even applied a hint of cosmetic blush and lip color. Just the barest hint. She didn't want to seem pushy. She had chosen her tan dress adorned with blue flowers and sleeves that flared slightly from the elbow, and with great effort she forced the dress's internal corset to at least give her the suggestion of cleavage. Her hair she brought up in a crown of curls. She had worn tight braids to bed to force her ordinarily limp hair to cooperate in the matter, and held it tightly with her new metal comb. She draped a pair of tan gloves in the crook of her arm as she descended the stairs into the kitchen, and took a deep breath to prepare herself for whomever was finishing their breakfast, and mentally preparing whatever excuse she was going to need. To her surprise, only her father was at the table, finishing a bowl of cereal and curds. He glanced up as she entered the kitchen, and his jaw went slack. Slowly he set his spoon down and watched her take a seat with a bowl of breakfast. "Goodness," he murmured distantly. "Look at you." Under her father's gaze, she blushed sheepishly and ate. "Stop staring," she said with a dismissive wave. The smile he gave to her was a pained one that looked out of place. "I suppose your mother is right," he whispered. 17. Is it too late to ask you to join me in the workshop later? Or have those years finally passed?" Indignantly, Andrea swallowed and sat straight in her seat. "In my opinion, there shouldn't be a time in which I can't." Still watching her distantly, he slowly propped his chin on his hand, his green eyes misty. "I wish it were so." She finished off her food, then stood to place the bowl in the sink. "You're embarrassing me, Papa." He chuckled and tapped his spoon on the edge of his bowl. I know, just..." He rose from his chair, readjusting his belt around his girth. "Let me take a look at you." Blushing again, Andrea held her skirt and performed a slow twirl for his benefit. He laughed lightly, then brought her into a hug, a tight one. "If all of this is for someone, I sincerely hope they appreciate it. Don't waste a single second of your time on them if they don't." He leaned back from her and placed a finger under her chin. "Do you understand?" She nodded happily and leaned in to plant a kiss on his round cheek. "I can't wait to go back to your workshop tonight. I must see the finished bird. I'll be back before you know it, Papa." As she all but skipped out the door that led into the courtyard, she could hear a small sound from him. "And then you'll be gone for good." The rain that had been pelting the streets early that morning had relented, and now the skies were clear. Andrea walked around puddles, her boots clacking against the wet cobblestone. A heavy mugginess hung in the air, so she fanned herself as she strolled. The usual crowds were wary to fill the streets, clinging to the sidewalks and under awnings in case a dreary rain would return unexpectedly. The courthouse was not a particularly long walk from the artisan district, even shorter than to market if she remembered correctly. There was only one turn on her trek that might risk its success. The most precise route would take her directly past the Journeyman Guildhouse. Andrea had strained to see Monty in any of his usual hiding spots, but he had been absent, which she only assumed meant he had gone to the Guildhouse to cure his cold. Journeymen rarely contributed to hospitals or the like, but it was known that mages had magical means to cure most ailments. It hardly seemed fair, but there was hopefully a good reason for the mages being so secretive on the healing arts. Either way, passing the Journeyman Guildhouse meant possibly running into Monty, or, oh dear, not Nicholas, and then having no idea how to explain her outing to him. The Mages' Guildhouse stood out among the bank, lending offices, and other official buildings. While any of the buildings were stately and imposing, the Guildhouse was more puzzling. The stone was completely white, with swirling carvings of the night sky superimposed with strange symbols and sigils. Above the entranceway was the seal of the guild, an open scroll with a lit torch in its center, flanked by statuary of winged men and women and wispy, pointed-eared Alvari. All of it was quite lovely, but unsettling in that no seams were noticeable in the structure, almost as though the entire building and every piece of ornamentation had been carved from a single, massive white block. Men Andrea assumed to be mages, at least suggested by how many still wore cloaks, hats, or thick long coats in summer, milled around the front steps and walked in and out of the building. She hurried her pace, keeping her eyes on the front doors. Her breath halted in her throat when she indeed spotted Monty stepping out of the tall double doors, looking extremely worse for wear. His brown hair always looked unkempt, but it was especially disheveled that day, hanging around his face, and his eyes had dark circles under them. She scurried a little faster, glancing over her shoulder to see him swig the contents of the vial and shudder violently with a look of disgust. But he hadn't noticed her. She had avoided him, despite all odds. When Andrea arrived at the courthouse, an imposing building with a solid, columned facade, and the clock tower looming above its center, she pulled on her gloves and summed up all of her courage. She was almost there. Her heart beating furiously, she strode inside past the various St. Emil's citizenry attending court for any number of reasons. She asked for directions at the front desk, and she was directed to one of the courtrooms where Sir Ventaris would be presiding that day. In matters of civil court, there was little call for prohibits on citizenry to witness proceedings, so she was allowed in the courtroom with not even a second glance from the guards in the hall. The room's rows of seats were largely empty, and her quiet entrance was unnoticed. She took a place in the back so as not to distract, though with all the shouting it would have taken a great effort to do so. Two men on opposite sides of the aisles yelled insults at one another, a court-appointed solicitor attempting to keep the peace. From what Andrea could gather, the entire argument was over the fruit of a pear tree. The tree had sprung up wild, near the fence of one man's land, then had dropped a good bit of fruit on the second man's property. The problem at hand then became, to whom did the fallen fruit belong? While heated, it was dreadfully boring to listen to, and she instead focused her attentions on the young man seated in the judge's chair. Alan Ventaris looked vastly different in his red-trimmed court regalia and a powdered wig. He appeared years older than 19, with an indifferent scowl on his face, and on his left hand he wore the heavy metal gauntlet of knights who served in court. As it seemed one of the farmers was about to climb out of his box to get at the other, Alan powerfully slammed his fist against the desk. The gauntlet caused the sound to echo in the most intimidating way possible, clanging against the high ceiling, and Alan repeated the motion twice more. Then all was silent. "The court has heard both sides," he began in a firm, unwavering voice that filled the chambers. "Mr. Myerscough, because right of ownership had not been established prior to this hearing, the pears on your property are yours to sell or use as you please." The second man almost piped up to speak, but Alan cut off any chance. "And Mr. Tattersall, from this day forth any and all fruit produced by the tree on your property is yours by rights, and you will have full right to prosecute if you can provide reasonable evidence of theft to city guard. By the power granted by the royal knights by the emperor, I call this case concluded." With a final firm knock of his fist against the podium, the court dismissed. The two men glared at one another, but were escorted out of the room by court guard without incident. Andrea hopped up and scurried between the audience that had stood as well. Andrea doubted more than one or two of the 10 or so present had any stake in the proceedings, and made her way to the back of the courtroom. Alan, however, had moved far too quickly for her to reach, and he disappeared through a door behind the judge's seat. She paused near the podium, glancing at the guard stationed against the wall, who was now eyeing her. It was not him who approached her, but a boy of 10 or 11. While young, his posture was straight and tall, and he wore a gold-trimmed green vest and coat, pristine black breeches, and a short, curled white wig. "May I help you, miss?" the young man said with perfect form. Oh no, not now. Why had she thought she could do this? The boy looked up at her, his expression unwavering, and gently motioned for her to proceed. I need to talk to, Alan. Her face immediately flushed violently. Had she just called him by first name as though they were familiar? What was wrong with her? "Who should I inform is asking?" Corsair, she pushed out, fiddling with the strap of her purse anxiously. "Andrea Corsair." "Andrea Corsair?" he repeated calmly. Yes. Tell him it's vital," she said quickly. He bowed his head and placed his hand against his chest. Then with a click of his buttoned shoes, he turned and walked to the same door Alan had disappeared through. A snicker was followed by a light cough, and Andrea glanced up to see the guard nearby, covering his mouth with his fist and staring in another direction. Growing even more red, Andrea turned her eyes to the floor and picked a loose thread on her purse. After what seemed an eternity, the young man reappeared and stepped up to her. With every step he took, she imagined the various ways he might tell her to shove off. She was so stupid for doing these stupid things. Sir Ventaris will see you. She gawked at him and blinked for a moment. He will? This way, miss. Reeling with new possibilities, Andrea followed as the young man's taller shadow. He led her through the door behind the judge's seat, into an office on the other side. The windowless room was small, the sides covered with shelves stocked full of heavy, leather-bound tomes of law. A low couch in front of a coffee table, and against the wall a far desk. Ellen, his robes and wig set aside, and dressed in his red and white knight's uniform, stood from the desk's chair. "Miss Corsair," he said amiably, his flawless face beaming. "Jacob, leave us." The young man bowed and stepped out, leaving Andrea alone with Alan. She smiled brightly. She could only hope she didn't look as desperate as she imagined. "I'm glad to see you're well," he began as he moved closer. "Although, are you?" Jacob said it was dire. Indeed he had. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. Some things have changed since we first exchanged pleasantries." Haltingly, carefully to reduce stutters, Andrea described the events of the night they had met, and the day after. The message dropped by the journeyman she had run into, and its purpose. The men from Suzdal Nurgovod who had made such a fevered attempt on their lives, and the assurance Nicholas had made for her safety, but how shaky she found that, coming from an apprentice mage succumbing to the elements. As she spoke, as there were several moments she had to recollect herself instead of stumbling over words, she anxiously watched Alan. He at first seemed amused, but the more she spoke, the more she watched his expression lose its serene smile. Then his brow knit, and his face grew hard in thought. As she finished, she uneasily took a long breath and released it. I hope you understand what I am asking, Sir Knight." "Indeed I do," he said low, folding his arms across his chest. This is all very troubling. This information you have is for the war effort." That is what I am told," she replied. He was quiet, raising a hand to his chin and rubbing it as his brow grew taut. "Nicholas," he whispered in barely a breath. "How long?" Sir?" Alan looked into her eyes and lowered his arms to his sides. "Andrea Corsair," he began in a gentle tone, "this is indeed a dire situation. One that puts the fate of all the Empire and her allies at risk." Yes, exactly," she said eagerly, nodding. "Then that's that," he replied firmly. For a moment it didn't quite register. Wait, that's that? You want to help me?" "Immediately," he scoffed. "I am among the Emperor's hand. I only wish I had known sooner." While Andrea slowly sat on one of the couches, her eyes large and her mouth hanging open in shock, he walked by her to the door. He knocked once, and she could hear Alan asking Jacob to ready his carriage. "But don't you have cases?" she offered, suddenly uneasy by how quickly this was happening. Despite having it run through her mind so many times, she had been wholly unprepared for events unfolding so closely to how she pictured them. Alan turned to her. "And a knight's duty is to the safety of the Empire first and foremost." He held out a hand, and Andrea's head felt dizzy. It reminded her so much of the first time they met, but the look on his face was now steady rather than warm. "I wish to waste no time." Andrea had never ridden in a private carriage. The entire experience was so new it left her speechless. She watched the streets roll by as the horses pulled the carriage. It seemed the House Ventaris was not in a rush to try out the mechanical carriages just yet, and anxiously her hands fiddled with the strings of her purse. The boy Jacob sat beside her. Rushed introductions had informed her he was in fact Alan's squire, the son of a family friend of great importance and an already budding knight. Jacob Perroy was reserved, listening to Alan's rushed explanation of the situation as they traveled. The boy would nod and occasionally straighten his white gloves, but he was clearly older than his years and had learned to allow his knight to lead conversation. There was little that seemed boyish in his wide brown eyes, mature even despite his youthful, round face, thin, shortly cut mouse-brown hair, and the scattering of freckles over his button nose. "As soon as we get to the manor," Alan finished, "I'll have you escort Andrea to the main parlor. I need to speak with Nicholas." "Yes, sir." Alan glanced out the window. "Seems we're nearly there." He then turned to Andrea and smiled gently, On my honor, you will be safe. Something this serious should have never been left only to mages," he added low. The carriage slowed, and Andrea swallowed hard as she watched the carriage roll through the open gates of the baronial manor. Through the windows she could see gardens lining the path toward the carriage house. Lattice arches entwined with bright roses spanned above them. Her eyes followed the path and soaked on the 4-story building she had never seen from below the line of its outer wall. Old vines climbed the richly red stone, the bright green sharp against it. The carriage came to a stop near the entrance, and Andrea barely knew what to do with herself. Her insides performed somersaults, and she could do little more than gawk as an actual footman opened the carriage door. Alan was the first to step out, then paused and turned to his squire. "Jacob, give me a moment to make certain the main parlor is ready. You will escort Miss Corsair there, and wait while I fetch Nicholas." "Yes, sir," he answered with a short bow of his head. Alan disappeared out of view, and Andrea became all the more anxious. Jacob?" "Yes, miss?" So much of the last few minutes had passed with her feeling like little more than a shadow. It was nearly startling to have Jacob's full attention. Now she wasn't even sure what to say. I don't have a gift for the Baron. I'm afraid I'm a terrible guest." He blinked once, then a small grin formed across his elfin face, and he laughed hard. For a moment she was afraid she had made a mistake by saying the first thing that had come to her, but then he bowed his head shortly. "Don't fret, miss. You'll be my guest instead. Now you'll simply owe me something later." It was the first thing he had said that made him seem his age, and it caused Andrea to relax exponentially. Well, thank you, Sir Perroy. I hope we spend time together long enough for me to think of something appropriate." "Candy is good," he informed her. A loud series of thumps hit the roof of the carriage, and the two of them jumped in surprise and stared at the ceiling. The carriage shifted as someone sat in the driver's seat, and Jacob shook his head. "The coachman must not know we're still in here. Then the two of them were nearly thrown from their seat as the carriage burst forward at full tilt, shouts trailing behind. Andrea's glasses had fallen askew, and she propped her arms against the walls. What's happening?" Jacob climbed over her to look through the back window, and she heard him whisper, "The coachmen are still out there. Who's driving?" Andrea steadied herself and moved to peer through the side window. She watched the gates of the Ventaris manor fly by, and then the buildings across as they rode hard. She let out a small shriek as a hand reached from the top of the carriage and flung the door open. Jacob held her hand as they both pressed against the opposite side, and a dark form flowed like water into the carriage. Too fast for detail to register, Jacob tried to slide between her and the intruder, but a quick movement sent him into the side seat, and the larger man's grip pressed Jacob's face and chest into the soft cushion forcefully. Andrea's breath became a tangle in her throat as she took in the man clad neck to boots in a fabric that seemed to meld with the interior of the carriage. All that was plainly visible was his head, completely shaved, an eye patch, and a single cold blue eye staring her down. "Hello, miss," he said in a low, rumbling voice. "There are matters we should discuss." For added emphasis, he grabbed the back of Jacob's collar until the boy was coughing painfully. The Nurgovod. She recognized this one, the one who spoke Garlish as though a native, and had thrown knives at she and Monty. Her eyes glanced at his thickly gloved hands and bracers, pondering for a moment if he still wore that large blade that would pop out near his wrist, if he was wearing it right then. Her blood ran cold, and feebly she tried to raise a hand in a silent plea for him to ease his hold on Jacob. How did they know she had the message? How could they have possibly known? Seeing her movement, a grin tugged at his lips, and he allowed Jacob more breath. "Your friend," he said icily. "The mage. Where is he?" Dryly she swallowed and shook her head. If Monty wasn't at the guild, then he was home, and she simply couldn't bear to say it. His cold smile faded, and with his left hand he slowly pulled a blade from the strap around his chest. "That is not an acceptable answer. Where is the maid?" "Ronan is his name. He is your friend, yes?" he said in drawn-out, deliberate syllables. Idly the short knife spun in his gloved fingers, nimbly changing position as it slid across his knuckles, into his palm, and back again with a flick of his fingers, glinting with each turn, polished and silver in the light. "Came all the way to Garland on mission, and yet spends his morning with you, rather than his network of spies. Tell me, how will we find him?" Why did they want Monty and not her? Did they not know? Her eyes still saucers, she sank further into the seat and shook her head again. "Please, I don't know," she forced herself to whisper. The Nurgovod's face darkened. "So it shall be." From the top of the carriage, a series of shouts in Nurgovod rang out. Andrea and the assassin in the cabin both glanced up. That voice she also recalled, the youngest of the three, the spindly, speedy one who had looked so tired. From the position of his voice, that meant the third was driving the carriage, the oldest one with broad, wide shoulders and towering height that in Andrea's mind she thought of as the mountain. The one holding Jacob scowled and looked through the back window. With the barest of glances Andrea could afford without offending her captor, her heart sped up and a smile came to her. Dashing toward them on horseback was Alan, his reddish hair fluttering in the wind along with his bright knight's coat. Gripping the reins of a gray-speckled, ebony-streaked stallion, he rode at rapid rate and leaned close to the beast. "Stop this carriage in the name of the Emperor!" he bellowed as the horse neared the vehicle. The Nurgovod let out an audible growl and scowled at Andrea. She sank away from his cold gaze, and her breath caught in her throat as he pushed his other hand against her chest. She found herself pressed against the wall, coughing much like Jacob as their captor used his grip on them both as some kind of leverage. His back facing one door, and the two of them held fast. His muscles seemed to coil like a serpent ready to strike. No, much more steady, more like a taut spring. From her extremely uncomfortable vantage point, Andrea struggled with his iron-gripped hand and helplessly watched Alan ride evenly with the carriage. While staring toward the mountain driving, Alan shouted again for the carriage to halt. In sunlight, briefly shimmered off his knight-issue revolver, a small, multi-shot gun held only by the Royal Order of Knights. Before Alan had time to ready his aim, the Nurgovod in the cabin thrust his legs like a shot. The door of the carriage flew off its hinges and straight at the horse and rider. The next seconds passed in a flash. In the time it took Andrea to let out a terrified cry, the door hit the poor beast in the side. There was a strained neigh from the horse, but then a streak of red, and the top of carriage jolted and rocked. The grip on both Jacob and Andrea released as the Nurgovod snapped in his native tongue and quickly propped himself in the doorless exit of the cabin. He shouted upward as there was clearly a struggle on top of the carriage. By the divine, she hadn't seen it, but somehow Alan had jumped the distance between his steed and the roof of the still careening vehicle. Was his poor horse all right? The Nurgovod threw a spiteful look over his shoulder at Jacob and Andrea, then pulled himself out of the cabin. Jacob heaved out painful breaths, and Andrea quickly went to him and helped him sit up straight. "Are you hurt?" she gasped out. He coughed again and wearily shook his head. The cabin swayed violently, and the two were forced to steady themselves or risk tumbling from the speeding carriage. He stared up at the ceiling, and his face grew tight in worry. "That's Alan, isn't it?" She swallowed hard, her heart racing. "Alone against two on a moving vehicle? He'll be killed for sure." Jacob shook his head. "There must be something we can do." A light went on behind his eyes, and he lowered himself to the floor and felt the boards beneath one of the seats. He laughed once as one of the boards moved aside, and from a hidden compartment he produced a heavy scattershot gun. Andrea's jaw dropped at the sight of it, an intimidating sight it was, as Jacob hurriedly checked the firearm and nodded to see it loaded. "Is Lord Ventaris a bit paranoid?" she whispered dryly. Jacob added a glance to her. "Nearly any nobleman will have one at the ready. I'll likely only have one good shot," he murmured. "The driver." Seeing Jacob smiling and then vulnerable had almost made her forget the youth was a knight in training. However, she quickly placed a hand on his shoulder. Something about his plan seemed wrong, and thankfully it had occurred to her then, and not after a shot. Distantly she recalled an accident that had happened at Marketplace. An elderly delivery man had succumbed to a feeble heart while still at the reins, and the horses had ridden on, following the orders jerkily given to them by the death grip the driver still had on the reins. "If he doesn't drop the reins, the carriage will crash at this speed. You and I would be the only ones with even the slightest chance." For a moment he stared at her sideways in confusion. Then suddenly her meaning dawned on him. "Oh, but I can't fire this at the fight on the roof. There's no way I wouldn't hit my master." A flurry of thought went through her mind, and quickly she voiced her thoughts as soon as they formed a cohesive plan. "The reins. Can you aim for the reins without hitting the horses? The driver is above them enough you should be able to. If the horses can't feel them, they're trained to automatically slow to a stop," he affirmed with a grin. "Help me hold steady." After explaining what he needed her to do, Jacob stood firmly in the door of the carriage, and Andrea tightly held his waist. Her feet were propped on either side of the door to ensure she was a proper anchor for him, although being so close to the rushing cobblestone made her tremble lightly. However, she dared not think on just how precarious a position the two actually held. Jacob slowly steadied the rifle, and she could hear the mountain notice the young rifleman all too late. A booming shot like a thunderclap shook through Jacob, and Andrea gripped him with all her might and pushed her leg straight, sending the two rolling against the opposite door, rather than the force of the large weapon sending Jacob into the street. Her all-too-sensitive ears rang and stung painfully, and she dragged her eyes open as she felt the speed of the carriage begin to slow. "We did it!" Jacob laughed triumphantly, trying to detangle himself from her. "It went right through the reins! We did it!" The top of the carriage rocked, and through the haze of adrenaline and her muffled hearing, she watched all three of the men who had been on top of the carriage tumble past its window. Andrea readjusted her glasses and tried to watch Alan pull himself from his feet painfully as the two Nurgovods rolled with the fall and crouched at the ready. A gasp lodged in her throat at how worn and exhausted Alan looked, his perfect uniform torn and bloody, and his hair mussed. His grip on his night-saber and pistol were steady, even despite how clearly she could see his shoulders shake. The two assassins dove back at him, but Andrea's attentions were drawn back to Jacob when she heard him cry out. The last of the Nurgovods, the massive, Ursine man, jumped down from the driver's seat. Again, Andrea's memory returned to the first time she had seen him. Again, that feral look twisted his expression. His singular eye was absent of rational thought as Jacob scrambled to reload a shot. She reached for him and blurted out that they had to run, but his stubborn hold on the firearm allowed the mountain to clasp the barrel fearlessly and yank both it and Jacob out of the carriage. Jacob hit the cobblestone with an undignified cry, and the gun spun away from him. Andrea watched him roll over and his eyes stare up at the mountain in terror, his small body quivering in his shadow. He wasn't a knight. He was only a boy. He was only a boy. The words repeated in her mind over and over again as the massive Nurgovod took hold of the scattergun and raised it above his head like a club. Andrea dove out of the cabin and tackled the mountain. Her weight barely caused a nudge in his stance, but it did bring his full attention to her. He grunted and grabbed her shoulder, and she felt herself fly backward. Her back hit the stationary carriage's wheel, and stars danced in front of her vision. Oh dear, also her glasses were gone again. Distantly, she thought she should fashion some kind of chain for the silly things, if she survived. By the divine, if she survived. The thought was chilling as she meekly looked up. The mountain threw his shadow over her, then knelt and yanked at the neckline of her dress. "Where is Magus?" he barked at her, shaking her. "I don't know," she sobbed out in terror, trying to pry his massive hand away and shaking her head wildly as she struggled to keep her feet on the ground. "Where is Magus?" he shouted louder, as though his volume were somehow the cause of her answer. Abruptly, thunder rolled above them. The pristine, blue afternoon skies were suddenly distressingly pitch. The hold the mountain held on Andrea slacked, just barely as he gawked upwards. With a crash of thunder and a bright flash, the clouds swirled, and a funnel shape formed, pointing ominously at the carriage and its former occupants on the ground. With a short jump, the mountain pulled Andrea to him and back several steps, but a violent gale yanked the two apart, and dust spun into the encircling force, barreling down upon them. Andrea saw her glasses on the ground nearby, and quickly crawled to them before they were pulled away for good, putting them on to stare clearly at the terrible storm rapidly descending. Flying steadfastly in its center was Master Nikolos.
Corsair Clockworks is an Ever Tomorrow production, plot by Jessie Lynn Jones and Marlon de Rivera, and written and performed by Jessie Lynn Jones. For more audio fiction, click the links and subscribe today so you'll always be ready for the next chapter.